All right. So the last thing that we saw yesterday is that you're not permitted to steal from someone, even if they give you permission to steal from them, right? So I guess it has to be expressed in a way that it's not stealing. In other words, feel free to come in and help yourself is different from feel free to come in and steal whatever you want. Okay. Okay, fine. Next she'ela. Likro l'mishtara b'shabbat kishro ganav b'veit shecheno. Are you allowed to call the police on Shabbos when you see someone breaking into your neighbor's house? What do you think? Can you call 911 on Shabbos? What if it's not pikuach nefesh? What if you know your neighbor's out of town?
It's damage.
You don't think you're going to call on Shabbos?
You're not saving.
I'll
You're
go
not
there.
saving a life.
Go there and make a citizen's arrest.
That you should definitely not do.
But you're not saving a life.
You're not saving a life, right? So technically, Marv is correct, right? You shouldn't break Shabbos. The Gemara even talks about the fact that if there's a fire burning down a building, as long as it doesn't present threat to life, let's say it's a standalone building in the middle of a field, yeah, so then you're not allowed to put out the fire on Shabbos. But anyway, let's see. She'ela, shchenim shehalchu li'itareach b'Shabbat b'makom acher. I have neighbors who went to spend Shabbos in another place, so I know the place is vacant. V'ro'eh shachen mimulo sheganavim nichnasim l'dirat chavero. And the next door neighbor sees that ganavim are coming to break into this guy's apartment. Ha'im yachol lahodia al kach l'mishtara be'emtzaut ha'telefon shebirshuto. Can I use the phone in on my property, in my house, and call the police? O yesh lo laharim kolo, or is it better for him to raise his voice? Kagon sheyesh kan ganovim. Hey, there's people who are robbers here. Kedei lahavriach otam, in order to chase them away. Velo yechalel Shabbat al yedei chiyug hatelefon. Is it better to do that because that way you're not violating Shabbos? Shuva. So the response is as follows: Imro'eh ganav aparetz l'dirat shcheno yesh lahavricho mibeli l'saken et atzmo va'aser lo l'talfein l'mishtara. If he sees a ganav breaking into his friend's apartment, he should try to scare them off without putting himself in danger. In other words, what if by going out of your apartment and raising your voice, you're going to put yourself in danger. But he says, as long as you can do it without putting yourself in danger, maybe open up the window and yell out, there's ganavim here. And therefore you would not be allowed to call the police. But if there's a non-Jew that's in the vicinity, Yomer Lagoy Lasot Kain Lihit Kasher Lemishhtara, you can for sure tell the non-Jew to call the police. Umuter Litvos Ulachazik Etakanav Be'eza Cheder Sagur, Kidei Lamosr Lemishhtara B'Yitziat HaShabbat. It'd also be permitted, if you feel you can do this, to grab the robber, grab the thief, I should say, and to keep him locked up in a room so that you can give him over to the police when Shabbos is over. Do you have to give him shalashudas? That's the question. I'm sorry, I have to keep you here until after Shabbos.
Yeah, you got 25 hours, but don't worry, I'll give you some food.
Oh my.
Yeah, but what happens if you so-called lock them in the room and then it's a heart attack? You know, they got it. Are you liable for that?
It's a good question. He's quoting a tshuva from the Tzitz Eliezer. Let's take a quick look at that tshuva. Dalid Bet. Okay, let's take a quick look at the Tzitz Eliezer. Dalid Bet. Shall we? Okay.
But it allows you to go count on one Jewish person to call the police, because you're not actually getting any benefit from it.
Correct.
So in what sense are you breaking Shabbos by asking the goy to do something that is not actually giving you benefit for him or you?
Well, you're not supposed to tell specifically to a goy to do a malacha.
Right.
So there's a special dispensation that if it involves a loss to your friend, then it is permitted. So the tshuva of the Tzitz Eliezer over here says, Shmirat HaShabbat b'mishtara. He says, Shabbos observance for the police. He's writing to Rav Herzog, who was the chief rabbi of Israel. And he apparently is reviewing a notebook, a kuntras, a manuscript that was sent to him about Shabbos observance when you're part of the police force. And so, and you want my opinion about it. So I went over this. ואני מתכבד בזה להמציא להדרס גאון מה שאלת במצורתי בעזרת השם בעניינים הנידונים, ואבוא בזה על פי סדר דברי כבוד גדולתו. So, he basically, this is a tshuva to go over this manuscript, which was developed for Jews who are part of the police force in Israel, who want to be Shomer Shabbos. So what is a Shomer Shabbos policeman? We should get Ralph Crombie in here. What does a Shomer Shabbos policeman do on Shabbos? When, let's say, he's on duty. Okay, now, this is especially relevant in Israel because here in Chutz La'aretz, a Shomer Shabbos cop can always arrange his hours to be taken by someone else on Shabbos. He probably would have an obligation to do that. But in Israel, you don't have that luxury if the vast majority of the police force is Jewish. Okay, so that's why I guess this is such a relevant issue.
You can't ask a non-religious Jew to work on.
No, it's even worse actually, because when a show, it's like I mean, this tshuva, the question you're asking, Hal, is relevant, let's say, when you're a doctor and you have partners who are doctors and they're not religious. It's actually worse to have them cover for you on Shabbos than it is for you to take Shabbos yourself. Because when you cover Shabbos, you'll restrict your activity because you're Shomer Shabbos and you know what to do and what not to do. But by asking them to cover you for Shabbos, they're going to be Machal Shabbos much more in a non-permissible fashion than you will. Yeah, so you're actually causing another Jew to sin. Yeah, right. So Shimush b'telephone b'tachanat hamishtara kavod gedulaso machlit shebeprotz riv ritzini bein anoshim she'enam kol kach tarbutiyim. He says, the concern is if, let's say, two guys get into a domestic dispute and they're not really very cultured people, so they're going to start punching each other. So there's a concern that if the police don't get involved early, there could even potentially be a loss of life. So based on that, it would be permitted to call the police if you see a fight breaking out among two people over Shabbos and they start getting into fisticuffs. You'd be allowed to call the police to have them break up the fight. ואם כי פעמים מטלפנים למשטרה על דברים שאין בהם סכנת נפשות, אך החטא הוא בראשו של המצלצל, ודבריו צודקים. He says, it's true that it could be that people call the police for things that do not involve a threat to life. But the sin will be on the head of the person who makes the phone call, if he doesn't make the call. So he says, Ach yarsheli kvod gdulaso lahatzia tikun shegam hamitzaltzalim lo yechtu af kishi yatalfenu lemishtara al dvarim she'ein bahem sakanas nefashos. But please allow me to suggest that there's no violation of Shabbos, or there's no sin, even if a person calls the police when there's not a sakana, there's not a threat to life. V'yesh bahem rak mishum miniat ktatot ushkeda al shalom hatzibur. And you're only calling the police in order to avoid conflicts and to restore peace to the neighborhood. In other words, even if you can't make the argument that by calling the police you're potentially avoiding a threat to life, I still feel, says Rav Waldenberg, that it's justifiable to call the police on Shabbos to avoid a domestic dispute. Ki harei ha'amon bahul al kol mikreh shel sichsuch u'mimaher miyad letalfein lemishtara mebeli tait el libo lahavchin im yesh beriv omnam ezech shah shel sakanas nefashos alo. He says, because we know that people generally call the police whenever there's something, a ruckus going on, even if there's no concern for loss of life. ובתיקון זה שברצוני להוציאה תוכל גם המשטרה להתקשר עם אנשיה לצרכים דחופים ונחוצים לתקנת הציבור, אף כשלא יהיה במניעתם שום חשש של סכנת נפשות. He says, and in this way, it'll be permissible for people who are on the police force, who are Shomer Shabbos, to use their phones and their walkie-talkies to reach out to people, even when there is no fear of a loss of life. V'hu ki yadua kovet chomer ha'isur b'sicha telefonit u'besug ha'telefonim asher b'yitzirat magal hazerim on tziltzul nidleket gam menorah b'merkazeha. Then he goes into the technical aspects of what violation is involved in using the telephone. He says, when you're using the old phones, you're getting involved in a potential Torah violation because there's sparks that are coming out of the phone when you use the dial. Okay. Yeah, this is an old shuva. Yeah. I'm just going to skip a little bit. Ulam gam im, so this is ot bet, which is what he referred us to. Gam im nitaken hadavar hazeh shel hatzaat hamenarot yeshadenu ladunu laachlit im ein be'etzim pulat hafalat hazer betelefon shal yedzehu machsher et hatelefon lamalei et tafkido mishum belechet bona o maka bepatish. Then he talks about, okay, what are the other potential violations of Shabbos, even if you're able to avoid the issue of creating sparks? Okay. So he's going through the technical issue. He says, he says, when you're he says it seems that it's permissible for a police officer, if he receives a call that there are ganovim in a certain place, that there are people breaking into a place, it would be permissible for a police officer to get in the car to drive there. This is because there could be people who will be injured or there'll be casualties if these robbers are armed. והייתי מוסיף לומר שהוא הדין שאפילו לא בו הגנובים עדנה, ולא מתעסקים עוד במעשה הגנבה אלא שממשמשים לבוא. I would go even further, even if they haven't even arrived at the crime scene yet, but someone wants to report a tip to the police that there are ganovim on the way. כגון שמרגישים בסביבה בתנועה חשודה של אלמנטים זרים. Let's say someone calls in something, something suspicious is going on. Someone's casing the joint. ויש חשש מבוסס לכך שמתכוננים לפרוץ בתים או חנויות. And there are grounds to suspect that there's going to be a break-in. שמותר למשטרה עם קבלת הידיעה על כך לצאת כנגדם במכוניות ובכלי זיינם ולחלל עליהם את השבת. It would be permitted for the frum police officers to get in their cars on Shabbos with their weapons to confront these guys or to anticipate their arrival. Kinifsak berama. This is paskined in the Rama. V'zeh pashut shezen shenizkar akom l'pnei shelo dibru ela b'hoive. Aval hu adin b'chiyai gafne b'listim Yisrael. Even though the Shulchan Aruch gives an example of non-Jewish robbers, he says, but that's only speaking in what was prevalent in those times. But in Eretz Yisrael, even if you know that the robbers are Jewish, you're allowed to be Machal Shabbos to prevent their arrival. Aval zehu b'nogei l'din hayachid al atzmo shebim lakachat mamono. Aval legabe achem shnichru lahatzala heim mutarim lachal gam heim haret tzrichim lachashosh al ha'echad l'shem lo yuchal limshol berucho milamud al mamona v'yamad negdam v'yehareg. He says the reason why, he says even though the Ramah says, he says Avsha Magen Avram Mechalek ben Sibur liyachid v'kotev sheba adam yachid yaniach likach mamona v'lo yichal al Shabbos. The Magen Avram is of the opinion that if someone's about to break in, you have to leave them alone and let them take the money. However, the police are still allowed to violate Shabbos because maybe they have to worry that maybe one resident will try to stop them and then endanger his life in the process. In other words, there are the rationale for allowing us to be Machal Shabbos to prevent robbers is because since robbers, if confronted, might use lethal force, you're allowed to prevent a robbery. But the Magen Avram says a person has an obligation to back away and avoid confrontation and let them steal from you rather than violate Shabbos. But he says,
From you, not the neighbor.
yeah, this is what he's talking about. But as far as other people who are called to save, to help out, they are allowed to violate Shabbos out of a concern that maybe that one of the neighbors who's being broken into will stand up to the robbers and endanger his life. So therefore, you're being called to potential life-saving situation. And who knows, how do you know how angry or emotional someone's going to get when he's confronted by the prospect of people breaking in and stealing from him? Okay.
In that scenario, you said that the person who's been broken into is not to call the police because it just let them steal the goods, but then the police are able to act, but somebody has to notify the police that the act is going on.
Yeah. So let's say someone's not Shomer Shabbos and they call the police, and I happen to be on duty. I'm a Shomer Shabbos Jew.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the psak is the police are allowed to go. So this is what the Tzitz Eliezer is addressing. We in the sefer that we're learning, he references the Tzitz Eliezer to talk about this whole idea of being Machal Shabbos to be able to prevent a robbery. And bottom line is that this sefer is paskening that you're not allowed to call the police if you can ascertain that the apartment is empty and it's just a question of them breaking in and stealing. There's no one's life is in danger. But let's say there's the possibility that the neighbor will come back and is just out for a few minutes. And there could be a confrontation. So then you would for sure be allowed to call the police. So that's an important issue. If you feel that there's even a possibility that someone's life might be in danger through this robbery, then you're for sure allowed to call the police.
But you're not allowed to call out to the robber to say, hey, stop what you're doing. Because the chances are that they may.
Well, you're confronted them.
You confront
Well, you're right.
them.
You shouldn't
Shouldn't
confront
confront
the
them.
robbers yourself.
So Rabbi, if they're in a big tall building in Israel, and you know your neighbor's not there, but you witness guys going into the neighbor with guns. You know that they've got to leave the building eventually as well, and people will be in the elevator, they'll be on the stairwell, they'll be in the front door area, and these guys are coming out with masks and guns, and anything bad could happen.
Yeah, then I would say you should call the police. Yeah. Because if you feel that there's a possibility that someone, you don't know, someone may try and stop them. Yeah.
What about you see these armed robbers coming into the guy's house, and you know the guy's home, he's in the back of the house, you see him through the window, you call him, tell him to get out.
Sure. Yeah, that would also be. Anytime you perceive that there may be a possible threat to someone's life, then of course use the telephone. Like, don't hesitate, is basically what I'm saying. And I'm glad he referenced us to the Tzitz Eliezer, because the truth is, when you just look at the tshuva, it seems like, yeah, you have to be machmir all the time. That's the point. There's a dividing line between when there's simply a loss of assets versus a potential threat to someone's life. So that's what the dividing line is.
It's a perceived threat to somebody's life, like, it's what you think might happen.
Well, you don't know. That's
Exactly.
the whole thing is that when someone breaks into a house, if they're prepared to steal, they may also be prepared to use force.
Right.
And you have to assume that. That's why the Torah says that when someone breaks into your house, you're allowed to use lethal force to stop them. Because you have to assume that they're prepared to use lethal force against you. And right, that's why, we always recommend that people in Canada have firearms, even though that's not the standard course of action. You probably will get arrested if you shoot a break-in robber, but they'll release you afterwards.
It's on your property, you're allowed to.
Yeah, they will arrest
defend
you.
on your property.
They will arrest you.
What?
You're allowed to, in Canada, you're allowed to defend on your property or not?
You gotta be careful, that's what.
Okay.
And here in Canada, can you defend yourself on your property?
Yeah, you can use reasonable force if someone's attacking you, but like, even if you have a gun, you can't shoot to kill. You have to wound or do something other than the extreme. You have to do something reasonable.
Yeah, what if I'm a bad shot?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I meant to hit him in the leg.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Unfortunately,
You
those are-
can't have traps and things like that. There's a criminal offense for selling traps, like.
Yeah.
these guys
Like Home
Put
Alone.
a bear trap in.
You can do that.
You can't do that.
They trap the front door.
Yeah,
Yeah, but if
by
you're
the
not-
way, there's a risk. He said also, you should detain the guy, Kim shall shoot us or whatever until whatever, if you're wrong. That, and say the guy actually was a cousin or something with permission to come in, you thought he was a robber, you detain him. It's a tort called false imprisonment, and you could be liable for that, right? Like, you think someone's shoplifting and you hold them for 2 days or something,
Kidnapping.
and you're wrong. You could be sued for wrongfully.
But Canada has this thing of citizen's arrest, like in the
Yeah,
US.
Yeah, if you see an offense, you can make a citizen's arrest. If you think you're wrong, detain them and call the police and do all the rest of it, right? You can't put them in your basement for 2 days.
It's a job as a 2-day job, you've got to.
You cannot call the police, so you put him in your basement for 3 days.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a 3-day hunting. Yeah.
I fed him, gave him water.
But Mark, if you don't have a licensed gun and you shot him, you're in trouble, right?
It doesn't make a difference.
The police hate people with guns here. The presumption is you've done something wrong if you use your gun.
Yeah, the license
But
doesn't-
that's,
doesn't
like,
cover it.
whatever, people will say, I'm gonna protect my life no matter what, then you take your chances. But I think the law is you just use reasonable force to defend you and yours.
What about if you shoot him with his own gun? You fight with him and you take his gun out, shoot him. It's also
Yeah,
not good.
again, self-defense, whatever, you have to be reasonable,
He will die, huh? Yeah, reason.
take them down and not kill them.
The problem is he can come back to you.
That.
Especially in Canada.
Okay,
But does it make a difference how you call the police? If you press one, the cell phone, you press one button just to call the police, or try to avoid use the cell phone? 911, or you put just one button to press?
is there one button to press on a cell phone?
Yes,
There
the
is.
emergency button, you call the police.
It's like a 1 or a 0. The button-
It's
Hold it,
when you turn off your phone, you press it, it's like it gets emergency call.
Emergency call.
and you just
If
press-
you-
Okay, when you're turning off your
On
phone,
iPhone, when you go to turn off
Yeah,
your
it
iPhone.
says
It
emergency.
says emergency call or turn off, and you have the option.
So does it make a difference to try to press less?
should you try to avoid, yeah, by doing
Instead
less?
of 911 or
Yeah.
whatever.
Mm. Or do you, and the other question is, do you have to use the shinoi? Let's say, do you have to use your left hand instead of your right hand in order to minimize malacha? I think that in a situation like this, where there's already a mandate to violate Shabbos, I don't even think a shinoi would
would
be required.
You're trying to do it as quick as possible.
Yeah, you have to just do it as quickly as
Try
possible.
and do it with your left hand.
Yeah, okay. All right, Kupat Yeshiva Shenigneva. All right, the pushka of the yeshiva has been stolen. So here's the sheila. Misha haya lo kupa b'veiso lahatrim li yeshiva la'iza keren shel gemilus chesed v'shamar aleha karoi. We saw this shaila in Rav Shraga's sefer also. A person has a tzedakah box. Remember in Rav Shraga's sefer, if you'll recall, who owns the pushka? In other words, so when the money gets stolen from the pushka and it's in my house, do I owe the money to the charitable organization because I was responsible to watch over their money? As soon as it goes in their pushka, do you say that it belongs to them? We said there's different kinds of pushkas. There's some pushkas that are provided by the charity and they maintain ownership of the pushka. There's other pushkas a private pushka that you buy on your own. Okay, so let's say you have a pushka in your house that is for the purpose of collecting money for a yeshiva or some other charitable organization, and you watched it properly. In other words, you kept it in your home under, let's say, when your house is locked, it's secure. V'nignava osa kupa o avda. Ha'im yesh alav chiyuv litain mos acherem laota kupa sha'asaf b'shvil ota yeshiva v'chulei. Ad sheyetze hasafek milibo kamatarim laota kupat tzedakah o shepater mikulam. So do I have an obligation, according to halacha, so as not to be liable for stealing from the yeshiva, to give the yeshiva what I estimate to be the amount of money that was in the pushka, because it was stolen from my premises, or am I exempt? Right. So I remember when we did this shuv in Rav Shraga's sefer, the issue was, how do we view the money that's put in the pushka? Is that considered in the possession of the yeshiva already? Or no, this is only a repository to accumulate money that will be given later to the yeshiva. So there are two ways to understand it. And he writes as follows, this Ahole Yaakov. Im nigneva o avda hakupa, ein alav chiyuv litain timurat otamot shiniach lekupat hatzedakah ela mipater mitashlum. He says, technically you're exempt. And the reason is because it's understood that the pushka doesn't belong to the yeshiva. It belongs to you. Amnam tov b'chol pam shenotein tzedakah laota yeshiva laota keren gamach yomer kach. But it is preferred, if you want to avoid any kind of controversy, then every time you put a coin in the pushka, you should say as follows: Kol hatzedakah shani notein mikan va'elach, im ani chayav latzei yidei shamayim otamot shani maniach bekupa zu yihiyah tumuratam. He says, what you should say is that from now on, any charity that I give from this point forward, if I have any kind of heavenly obligation to replace the money that was stolen, the money that I'm giving now should be in its stead. And if not, if I'm not obligated, then this money should be like any other tzedakah. In other words, if the pushka gets stolen, you should sort of think to yourself that all future donations that I make to the yeshiva, if I'm liable on some level, this should be as a replacement for the tzedakah that I previously was holding for them. Until you give enough to that yeshiva in the future to cover what you feel might have been in the pushka. And it's an interesting kind of thought.
But basically, the repayment is just a matter of starting again.
All future donations that you make are sort of to say to yourself, if for whatever reason I have an obligation to make good on what got stolen, this is sort of its replacement. Okay, we'll hold it here.
Complicated. But if